Now I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Sister Mauryeen O'Brien, one of our own Dominican Sisters of Peace, who has come from New Haven, Connecticut, to share her expertise and her compassionate approach to the journey through grief. Sister Mauryeen is coordinator for ministry to the bereaved, separated, and divorced for the Archdiocese of Hartford, Connecticut, certified in bereavement and divorce counseling, and facilitator training for support groups and seminars for the bereaved and divorced. She has published several books related to her ministry, including Praying Through Grief, Gentle Keeping, Lift Up Your Hearts, and the most recent, The New Day Journal, A Journey from Grief to Healing. Sister Mauryeen is also a graduate of Notre Dame University. She has received several awards and recognitions for her commitment and service to those who mourn, most recently honored by the city of New Haven as one of its most amazing women. We certainly agree. Welcome, Sister Mauryeen.
Thank you very much, Christina, and thank you very much, the audience near and far. I said to Christina, we have the in-house people and we have the outhouse people. Let me tell you a little story. Once upon a time, a man was walking down the street, and he happened to look down, and he saw a butterfly trying to make its way out of its cocoon. It was halfway out, and he was a very compassionate man, so he took out a pocket knife, he picked it up, and he started to pare away the cocoon. And indeed, he set the butterfly free. And it rose to the sky, flooded its wings, and then fell to the earth, and it died. He felt terrible about that, and he was telling a friend of his the next day what had happened, and the friend stopped him in the middle of the sentence, and he said to him, you know, you did the worst thing you could have done for that butterfly. By robbing him of the struggle that it takes to get out of the cocoon, you rob him of the opportunity to strengthen the muscles in order to fly. You cannot take away from the butterfly the struggle. You know, a wonderful impulse of the human heart is a desire to alleviate the sufferings of others, and that's wonderful. It's wonderful news. And yet we know, and you know most especially, that grief can't be fixed. Those who grieve cannot be robbed of the struggle, just as the butterfly in the story. But we can journey with those who are grieving, and we can grieve with them or with ourselves, and above all, we can love them most tenderly. So let's look at what you and I and those who have gone through the grieving process go through as they face the death of a loved one. You know, in the normal course of events, each one of us, and I'm sure you have, most of us have, gone through some kind of physical surgery in your life. Some will experience minor surgery, some really major surgery, but whatever it is, we know that physical surgery causes us some sort of trauma, and that we have got to take time in order to heal. Usually those around us, doctors and family and friends, and even bosses on our jobs, seem to understand that time is needed for recuperation from surgery. In fact, doctors won't let you out of the hospital until you can prove you can walk down the hall. And family fall over themselves trying to give you the best chicken soup that they can make. And even bosses on a job get someone to do your work, or they take your work and they put it on the person who sits next to you at work, and they get a double dose. But whatever happens, everyone seems to know that physical surgery deserves and will have to have time if we're going to recuperate. Well, I wonder if we've ever realized that loss of someone through death has been compared to the severest of surgery. We're told that it is worse than physical surgery. And I wonder if our healing expectations of the bereaved or of ourselves who have had perhaps a death in our family or our friends is the same as the expectations we have for those who go through physical surgery. What happens to the patient after physical surgery, they're given time to heal, they can express their feelings, they can put aside pain with medicine, and they can start to build up a healthy life. So what should happen to us if we're going through what I call emotional surgery, what we go through after the death of someone we love? Why can't we take the time to heal, to grieve, to cry, and above all, really, to talk? How much time will we need? We don't know. Can't be measured. For each person heals in their own time. Grief is a process that has to be worked through after emotional surgery. Notice I said worked through. We're told that grieving is probably the hardest work you'll ever do. And if you have grieved, I think you can agree with me. I picked up something the other day to read, and I'd like to read it to you. It's very interesting about a man who was going through grieving. Here's what he says. It was over 6 years ago that I struggled going through the grief process when my son died. I struggled until my parents died. And then I got mixed up and thought I didn't have to do that anymore. I didn't have to grieve anymore. I thought I could climb over the grief, or under it, or ignore it altogether. But I was wrong. I found out that I had to go through it. And that particular man found that he could go through it easily, more easily, if he belonged to a group of people who understood what he was going through. Well, what about the patient, the you and the I, who are recovering from this emotional surgery? What do we need? And what should happen in our lives to help us? I think we need, above all, to do the work of grief. And grieving is a very normal, healthy activity. I think, though, society has the attitude that one mustn't grieve, one must be strong. Or as the Irish said, one mustn't hang out the dirty laundry. No one wants to appear in front of others grieving, and yet we know it's very, very important. Remember Jackie Kennedy when her husband was shot? I remember I was a child and remember seeing her walk down the street in that funeral procession with the black veil over her face, and she walked tall and strong. And I thought, isn't she wonderful? Now, I'll make a bet that she probably went into the White House afterwards, closed the door, and cried and grieved. But she had a role to play, so she was not going to grieve in public. But I'm sure Jackie Kennedy certainly did grieve. And I'm sure you know a lot of people like that, people who don't show their grief and yet need to go through it. As we examine the aspects of the grief journey, maybe we'll be able to understand a little bit more what to expect when we mourn or when we have others that we love who are grieving. Maybe we can understand that people need to move through that journey, that they can't get stuck, because if they do, they're not going to be able to go on with a new life. So I'd like to just reflect with you this afternoon on working and really praying through the whole grieving process, because prayer is a big part of that too. And I'd like to reflect on the need we have to develop the muscles to fly, just like a butterfly did. The work of grief. Most of us are not prepared for the long journey of grief, which is sometimes devastating, frightening, and often very lonely. We may think, we may do, we may say things that are very unlike us. There seems to be no respite, no end to the intense feeling we go through. How would you describe grief? Well, it's been described in several different ways. Someone said it's like a raw, open wound. With great care, it eventually will heal, but there'll always be a scar. You'll always know that you've lost someone you loved. But eventually, you'll be able to move on whether you have that scar or not. Sometimes it's been compared to a severe storm at sea. The waves are very big and devastating, and then they calm down, but then they come up again. Grieving is like that. Sometimes we're calm, and sometimes we're not. The process is very common, but it also has its unique sides. It's a universal experience, but no two people grieve alike, not even in the same family. In a way, it's like love. No two people love alike. When we're grieving, we can't control our feelings. Those feelings come from deep inside, but we can choose to do what we can with them. So remember, feelings are neither bad nor good. It's what we do with those feelings that make the big difference. We have no choice about grief. We must go through it. If we grieve the loss of someone we love as they are dying or as they have just died, we start our process of moving on and living a new life. If we wait for a while, we slow down that process of living a new life. Grief has no timetable. It often takes longer to get over than we expect. Some people, it takes an hour, some a day, some a minute. It just depends on us. But remember, there is hope. People have a natural inclination to heal. Eventually, if we do our grieving work, we will look back and we'll know that we're not crazy, we're just grieving. So we need to be patient with ourselves and with others who are grieving. Grieving or mourning is an adaptation to loss. It seems to involve what we have termed the 4 tasks of grief. You all remember Elizabeth Kubler-Ross gave a beautiful book really on what we go through when someone is dying, and she brought in all the emotions that we go through. Well, grief experts today tell us there's even more to that, and they have termed it the 4 tasks of grief. Notice the word tasks. You have a task, you know you have to get something done. They don't naturally come in a specific order, although I'll give you them in an order, because we can go through one task and go on to the next one and then slip back to the first one, go to the third, slip back to the second one. It's all going on at the same time. But to go through those tasks is what we need to do. So the very first task of grief is to accept the reality of the loss. When someone we love dies, even if that was expected, there's always a sense that it hasn't happened. So the first task that we need to go through is to come full face with the reality that a physical reunion is not possible. I worked with a young woman one day who lost her very young husband, and she came to me and she said, "Sister, I have been sitting at the front door of my house for 29 days after he died, waiting for him to put his key in the door and come in after work." She said, "I don't know what happened the 30th day, but I finally realized that he was not going to come home." Now, it took her that long to come to a reality that her husband, John, would not be coming home. If she had stayed with that concept much longer, she really would have needed some more help than I personally could give her, because she would have been, as we say, stuck in her grief. But she did come to the reality, and then she did start to work through that whole process. She didn't want to believe it because she didn't want to believe that he had died. So she was going to say to herself, he's going to come in at 5 o'clock. So usually the first reaction to really any kind of a loss is a sense that it hasn't happened. I don't know if you ever do that or not, but I know when I lose something, I say to myself, I can't believe that happened. Anything. And especially in something as big as the death of someone, we just don't want to believe it. So we try very hard to not accept the reality. So how do we help people? How do we help ourselves move through that first task of grief? Well, we get the person or ourselves to talk specifically about the person who has died. Every time we mention the name, every time we tell something about them, we begin to really realize that their physical presence will no longer be here. Conversation, certainly when someone dies, takes place at the wake and at the funeral. We hear story after story about the person, and that helps us. You know, today a lot of people are not having wakes, which is a shame, because that's the place where people come and bring their stories about the loved one, and that helps us to move through the whole grieving process. But, you know, that should never end at the wake and the funeral. There should always be a way that we can talk. So we need to get a person, a friend, family, if they can stay with it, because they're grieving too, which is very difficult, or a support group, some place we can go where we can talk about the person we loved. And that's going to help us move through that first task of grief. The second task is to process the pain of the grief. To really acknowledge that we have a lot of feelings that are going on because that person has died. Now, not everyone feels the same intensity or all the feelings that go on that another person does. And society makes it very hard to complete that task. Society tells us, you don't need to grieve, you need to be strong, just like Jackie Kennedy, and you need to not show your feelings. So it's very, very difficult, especially, I think, for men, because we have that old adage, you know, men don't cry. And so they hold it in. We need to get it out. In order to get away from all what's going on, a lot of people really get an overkill in activities. I always say, beware of the person who volunteers for everything that's going on, because they're trying to forget what has happened and to keep busy, is what they say. But someday it catches up to you. So we need to look at our emotions, and that's where Elizabeth Kubler-Ross certainly came in. Separation pain is experienced very intensely. Feelings can overwhelm you. You may think, I've never had a lot of feelings, but my, when someone you love dies, the feelings just come out. What are they? Many times, anger, guilt, helplessness, anxiety, jealousy, sadness, felt in many, many forms. I mentioned jealousy. I had a little lady who had lost her husband. I would say she was about 80 years old, and she was really grieving the death terribly. And in my office, the co-directors run conferences for people preparing for marriage. And they said to me, why don't you bring this little lady to the conference? They'll see young people coming to the conference. She'll feel good about that, and it might help her. So she came, and I put her at the registration desk. She wasn't there 10 minutes when she came to me, and she said, I can't stay. And I said, all right, but could you tell me why? She said, I've just found out I'm a jealous lady. Now, if you ever saw her, you'd never think she was jealous. But what she said was, I see those young people coming in, they're holding hands, they're looking at each other, they're very happy, and I say to myself, I'm jealous of them. I'm never going to have that again. Now, she wasn't a jealous lady, but here was a feeling that she had never experienced before, and she needed to talk about it, and we did. So feelings are very, very important. We need to say, I'm angry, or I feel sad. And then the proverbial one that everyone just kind of feels very bad about, but finally they can say, and I'm angry at God for letting this happen. It's amazing when you go to a support group and someone says that. I'm angry at God for what's happened. And someone across the table will say, well, I am too. And then maybe someone else will say, well, I was, but I did this to try to help myself. You see how a support group can be very helpful to people. So that second task of grief then is to go through all the feelings that have suddenly loomed up and to talk about them, to talk them out. And I would say probably one of the greatest ones is guilt. I used to think the Irish were the ones that captured that, but I find in every nationality it's guilt. We seem to carry that around with us all the time. But if we can talk about it, it's very, very helpful. I want to talk a little bit about shock, because many times when there's a sudden death, we're shocked by that. But in the normal course of events, even when there isn't a sudden death, if there's a prolonged death, when the death actually happens, we go through shock too. It's just because we love so much, and we've just unnerved ourselves because of that. So we shouldn't be afraid of some of the emotions that really develop because of this. But if we can talk about them and if we can talk them out, it's very, very helpful. It's very, very normal. It's normal to have these feelings. That's the second task. The third task is to adjust to a world without the deceased. Loss forever changes your world. It's a new environment, both personal and social. An ending has occurred, and beginnings need to happen. But before the beginnings happen, we need to go through a period of transition. During that time, we need to examine just what has happened because of the ending in our life. What's changed? What remains the same? What's new? What experiences? What roles? What expectations? What values? What opportunities? What dreams are to be given up? And what new ones can be assumed? So much to think about. And that's to adjust to a world without that person. The way we will adjust to it is based on the relationship we had with the person, the roles that person played in our lives. If we're married and our husband and myself played bridge every Friday night, what happens the first Friday night if my husband has died? What do I do? Do I not go to the bridge party? Do I try to find someone else to play it? Or do I say to myself, I'm never going to play bridge again? If your husband dies, he was the plumber in the house. Whenever there was a leak, he did it. What happens the first time? It leaks. First of all, I get mad at him because he's not there. But then what do? Do I go next door to the poor person I've asked 1,000 things from to help me? Do I call a plumber, which is very expensive? Or do I learn to plumb myself? What do I do when these roles that this person played in my life are no longer there? Am I going to give them up entirely? Am I going to find someone to take their place, not take his place or her place, but to take the role on? But what am I going to do? Besides the roles, there are levels of loss that we go through in this particular task of grief. Loss of identity. We usually play roles of service in each other's lives. When someone we love dies, we lose that role. If I'm taking care of someone who's very, very sick and they die, I've not only lost that person, but I've lost the role of caregiver. And that's a tremendously hard thing to do. It's almost like a double loss there. A loss of a change in lifestyle forces a person to begin a new way of living. And I think of that in regard to widows and widowers. I choose to be married, and when my husband or wife dies, I've lost that particular lifestyle. And what am I going to do that? In the death of a child, do I say to myself, now I'm no longer a mother, now I'm no longer a father? You see how that is so strong, that role of service in their lives, that they've lost that role also. Loss of the past many times. When I lose my parents, they have my whole history. Who else would have that? And I've lost a lot of that if I haven't really learned as much as I could from my parents. Loss of the future, especially if a child dies. All the dreams I had for the child. All the dreams I had for myself. We always say, we're going to do this when we retire. And then someone dies and we don't do that. So there's a part of the future that I lose. And of course, loss of the present. The person is no longer there in your life. Loss of dreams and how we love to dream. And those dreams can no longer be fulfilled with that particular person. What do I do about that? And as many have experienced many times, a loss of health, because it takes its physical toll on us when we're grieving. So you see, there are many levels of loss. There are many roles that we need to work through when someone we love dies. And is it any wonder that it takes such a long time to go through the grieving period? Because we need to grieve all those things. The last task of grief is to find an enduring connection with the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life. This fourth task asks us to start to collect our cherishable memories of our loved one. It's those memories that are going to help us move through that awful journey of grief. And it's sharing those memories with others that are going to help us. So this task, we ask people to talk about the person, to journal about the person, to just get out of you and put out there all the wonderful traits of the person, and then collect them and take them to your heart. And when they're in your heart, you can move through a new life because you're always going to carry that person with you. So those are the four tasks of grief. Is it any wonder that it takes a while? How long does it take? We don't know. We're told that probably it takes at least a year going through the 4 seasons and all of the holidays and things that you did together during those 4 seasons before we can even think of moving through that journey of grief. But if you keep working on it, it can happen. I think as we allow God to direct our choices after a tragedy, 2 unfolding spiritual understandings unite our fighting minds and emotions. The first one is that God's Spirit dwells within us. If we choose to follow God's leading, we gradually can control our grief. And the second understanding is that with God in us, the difficulties of life are hurdles, not walls. Tragedies become challenges that build as opposed to blocks that stymie us. So we need to think about that. We need to think of where God takes a place in our grieving process. Let him in. He can help you. There was a woman who lost her son to suicide. She had the question all through the rest of her life, really, of why. Why did this happen? She wrote a book. It's called My Son, My Son. And in the book, she journeys through that entire book of losing her faith, blaming God, and then finally coming to the realization that her son would not want her to stop living. He would want her to live. All of our loved ones would want us to live after they have died, and they want us to live a happy life. At the end of the book, she wrote this poem I'd like to share with you. And she says, I don't know why. I'll never know why. I don't have to know why. I don't like it. I don't have to like it. What I do have to do is to make a choice about my living. What I do want to do is accept it and go on living. That choice is mine. I can go on living, valuing every moment in a way I never did before, or I can be destroyed by it and in turn destroy others. I thought I was immortal, that my family and my children were also, that tragedy only happened to others. But I know now that life is tenuous and valuable. So I am choosing to go on living, making the most of the time I have, valuing my family and friends and my God in a way never possible before. She made the choice to go on living because she felt that her son would want her to do that. And she lived to write this most beautiful book and to help us when we go through the grieving process to not only look for God, but to try to embrace him so that a new life can be lived. I ask you to do the same. Let God into your life. Let those people who love you, who want to be there with you, into your life. Talk to them. Let them listen to what you have to say. You have a story to tell, and they want to hear that if they love you. So I thank you for coming this afternoon. I thank you for letting me be here. And in prayer, let us walk with each other through this journey of grief. God bless.